For 3 decades, England tore itself apart. It was a savage series of civil wars where brother fought brother, noble houses were wiped out, and the crown was tossed between rivals like a blood-soaked trophy. This was the War of the Roses, the real-life Game of Thrones. And as a lad from Yorkshire, this is the story of my home county's dynasty, the House of York, fighting for the ultimate prize. But the real story is so much more complex than just the White Rose of York versus the Red Rose of Lancaster. It's a messy tale of ambition, betrayal, and a kingdom pushed to its absolute limit. So, what really kicked off this brutal conflict, and how did it reshape England forever? Let's get into the unbiased truth behind the war that defined an era. To really get this, we have to rewind the clock way before the first battle. The roots of the war were tangled up in a succession crisis and the disastrous reign of King Henry VI of the House of Lancaster. Henry VI got the throne as a baby and grew into a weak and ineffective king. He was prone to bouts of mental illness that would leave him totally unresponsive for months at a time, creating a massive power vacuum right at the top. This weakness was made worse by England's failures abroad. The Hundred Years' War with France, which was once a source of national pride, ended in a humiliating defeat with huge amounts of territory lost. Back home, the economy was tanking, taxes were sky high, and justice seemed to be for sale, which led to anger everywhere. Powerful nobles with their own private armies started acting like mini kings in their own lands. Their loyalty was to their local lord, not some distant, fragile crown. And into this chaotic mix stepped a major player, Richard, Duke of York. As a direct descendant of King Edward III, many people believed he had a stronger claim to the throne than Henry VI. At first, Richard didn't play the part of a usurper. He presented himself as a reformer, someone who could clean up the corrupt court and restore order. He was even appointed protector of the realm during one of Henry's breakdowns. But the king's powerhouse wife, Margaret of Anjou, saw York as a direct threat to her son's inheritance and did everything she could to undermine him. The stage was set for a showdown. It wasn't a question of if a civil war could start, but when. In 1455, all that simmering tension finally boiled over at the First Battle of St Albans. Richard of York and his allies, including the seriously powerful Richard Neville, Earl of Warwick, marched on the king's forces. It was a small battle, but a big deal. Key Lancastrians were killed and King Henry VI was captured. York had won control of the king. For a few years, a very fragile peace held, but it was basically a cold war with occasional flare-ups. It couldn't last. Queen Margaret of Anjou refused to accept any deal that disinherited her son, Prince Edward. She gathered a huge Lancastrian army in the north, ready to crush the Yorkists for good. This led to the Battle of Wakefield in December 1460, a total disaster for my home county. Richard, Duke of York, charged out of his castle. We're not sure if it was because he was reckless or because he was tricked, and his army was swamped. Richard was killed in the fight. In a final brutal insult, the Lancastrians stuck a paper crown on his severed head and put it on display over the gates of York. The Yorkist cause looked like it was over, but Richard's death didn't end the war. It just made his eldest son, Edward, Earl of March, furious. Edward was a brilliant military commander and he took up his father's cause with a vengeance. In 1461, on a freezing Palm Sunday in a blinding snowstorm, the two armies met at Towton in Yorkshire. It was the largest and bloodiest battle ever fought on English soil. An estimated 50,000 to 65,000 men fought for hours in savage hand-to-hand combat. The Yorkists, helped by reinforcements arriving just in time, finally broke the Lancastrian lines. The retreat turned into a slaughter, with thousands killed as they tried to run. The Battle of Towton was a crushing Yorkist victory. Henry VI and Queen Margaret fled to Scotland, and Richard of York's son was crowned King Edward IV. Phase 1 was over. The House of York was now on the throne. Edward IV's reign did bring some stability, but it was a peace built on a shaky alliance. The main architect of that alliance was Richard Neville, Earl of Warwick, the man who had been key to putting Edward on the throne. Now known as the Kingmaker, Warwick was the most powerful and wealthy nobleman in England. For a while he basically ran the country. But the relationship between the king and the Kingmaker started to go sour. Edward IV was confident and stubborn, and he started to push back against Warwick's control. The breaking point came when Edward secretly married a commoner, Elizabeth Woodville, for love. This was a huge problem because Warwick was in the middle of negotiating a major political marriage for him with a French princess. Edward's secret marriage infuriated Warwick and a lot of the old nobility, who saw the Queen's massive family as a bunch of upstarts hungry for power. Feeling his power slipping, Warwick did the unthinkable. He switched sides. He made a secret alliance with Edward's own treacherous brother, George, Duke of Clarence, and his old arch-enemy, the exiled Lancastrian Queen Margaret of Anjou. In 1470, Warwick invaded, forcing Edward IV to flee the country. Then he dragged a bewildered Henry VI out of the Tower of London and put him back on the throne. The Kingmaker had lived up to his name, taken down the very king he had created. But Edward IV wasn't finished. With help from abroad, he landed back in England in 1471, ready to take back his kingdom. He met Warwick's forces at the Battle of Barnet. In the thick fog of an Easter morning, total confusion led to Warwick's army being defeated. The Kingmaker himself was killed trying to escape. A few weeks later, Edward marched to face the last Lancastrian army, led by Queen Margaret and her 17-year-old son, Prince Edward, at the Battle of Tewkesbury. The Lancastrians were annihilated. The young prince, the last hope of their house, was killed in the aftermath of the battle. Queen Margaret was captured. To make absolutely sure there were no more threats, King Edward had Henry VI quietly murdered in the Tower of London. The direct Lancastrian line was extinguished, and Edward IV was once again the undisputed King of England. For over a decade, England was finally at peace. Edward IV was an effective ruler. The economy was recovering and the wounds of the war were starting to heal, but all that stability depended on one man. Then, in 1483, disaster struck. Edward IV, still in his prime at just 40 years old, died suddenly, plunging the kingdom right back into crisis. His heir was his 12-year-old son, now King Edward V. The boy's protector was his uncle, Richard, Duke of Gloucester, Edward IV's loyal younger brother. Richard escorted the young king to London, supposedly for his coronation, and lodged him in the Tower of London. The boy was soon joined by his 9-year-old brother. What happened next is one of the most persistent mysteries in English history. Richard announced that his brother's marriage to Elizabeth Woodville had been illegal, which made their children illegitimate. With Parliament's backing, he had the boys declared bastards and took the throne himself, becoming King Richard III. The two young princes, last seen playing in the Tower Garden that summer, were never seen again. The common assumption, pushed hard by Richard's enemies, is that he had his own nephews murdered to secure his crown. Richard's defenders argue there's no concrete proof and that other people had a motive to get rid of the boys. But the simple fact is, two young princes went into the tower and vanished. The suspicion around their fate hung over Richard III's reign like a dark cloud and gave his enemies the perfect propaganda weapon. If you're finding this journey into England's past fascinating, make sure to subscribe and hit that notification bell so you don't miss my future deep dives into history. And let me know in the comments, who do you think was the most ruthless figure in this conflict? The scandal around the princes, along with the view of Richard III as a tyrant, created an opening for one last long-shot Lancastrian claimant, Henry Tudor. Living in exile in France, Henry's claim to the throne was incredibly weak, coming through an illegitimate line. But with the main Lancastrian line dead, he was the only hope for those who hated Richard. He played a brilliant political move, promising to marry Elizabeth of York, Edward IV's eldest daughter. This was designed to unite the warring houses and pull disillusioned Yorkists over to his side. In August 1485, Henry Tudor landed in Wales with a small army of mercenaries and English exiles. He marched into the heart of England to face King Richard III at Bosworth Field. Richard's army was bigger, but his support was shaky. The battle's key moment came when the powerful Stanley family, who had thousands of men on the field, refused to join the fight, just waiting to see who would get the upper hand. Seeing Henry Tudor with just a small bodyguard, Richard III made a fatal choice. He gambled everything on a single, desperate cavalry charge aimed right at his rival, hoping to end the battle in one move. The charge almost worked. Richard cut down Henry's standard bearer and got within a sword's length of Henry himself, but at that critical moment the Stanleys finally made their move, attacking Richard's flank. Richard was unhorsed and surrounded, but he refused to flee. He was killed fighting, the last English king to die in battle. With Richard's death, the battle was over. The crown was supposedly found and placed on Henry Tudor's head right there on the battlefield. He became King Henry VII. He kept his promise and married Elizabeth of York, uniting the Red Rose of Lancaster and the White Rose of York into the new Tudor Rose. While a final Yorkist uprising was crushed 2 years later at the Battle of Stokefield, the Battle of Bosworth Field is seen as the traditional end of the War of the Roses. The wars left a deep scar on England. The old medieval nobility was decimated, strengthening the power of the crown. The conflict brought in a new dynasty, the Tudors, who would rule for over a century. They would oversee England's transformation from a fractured medieval kingdom into a powerful Renaissance state. The fighting was over, but the memory of those 3 decades of brutal civil war would haunt England for generations. If you like learning about British history or Britain in general, then remember to like and subscribe, and I will see you in the next one. Bye for now.